Hello and welcome everyone to the Heritage Pod. I am Joyita Devnath, a student of the Department of Media Science, the Heritage Academy. Today we are here to discuss certain integral concepts in the realm of photography and filmmaking, and today we have with us Professor Agnichita Mukherjee, who is going to explain those concepts. Hello ma'am. Ma'am, could you please elaborate on the concept of the rule of thirds in the realm of photography?
Of course, thank you, Joyita, for the question. See, rule of thirds is a very basic concept in photography that a lot of students tend to get confused about. It's one of the elementary concepts in photography, especially when it comes to understanding framing and the aesthetics. So the idea was given by John Thomas Smith as far ago as 1700s, and the entire idea of rule of photography, rule of thirds in photography, is that you basically take your frame and you divide it into thirds, equal thirds, vertically and horizontally. So by doing that, you come up with sort of a grid on your screen. And when you have that grid, you will have points of intersection. So effectively over here, you have 4 points of intersection. And what we must do after that is try and ensure that our subject, which is our primary focus of interest, all of that, the subject needs to be placed in or around those 4 points of intersection or points of interest. And not only can we use the points of intersection as guidelines in framing, we can also use those lines that are equally dividing the screen. We can also use those lines as our guide as well. For example, if you are shooting a scene at the beach. So when that happens, the rule of thirds actually helps us to divide the frame very aesthetically, where you can kind of ensure that the sky is in the top 1/3 of the frame, the sea or the water is in the central 1/3 of the frame, horizontally speaking, and the beach or the sand is at the bottom 1/3 of the frame. So rule of thirds is one of the key tenets of photography, one of the very primary concepts which any beginner in photography needs to follow, and practice makes perfect. So the more you follow the rule of thirds, the better you're going to get at it, and eventually it'll become second nature.
That was quite insightful, ma'am. Thank you. Now, moving on. Ma'am, could you please enlighten us on the concept of the depth of field, and how does this concept kind of impact the photographer while capturing images?
Of course. So another very important element of photography is understanding depth of field. Now, while it might sound like a lot of jargon in photography, but depth of field is actually a very elementary concept. So simply speaking, depth of field is the area in your photograph which is in sharp focus, or if I can use other terms, the area in photography that is an acceptable focus, right? So thereby, having said that, we can say that the depth of field in a photograph is shallow if there is a very limited range in a photograph which is in sharp focus. We say that the depth of field in a photograph is deep when there is a larger area in a photograph which is in sharp focus. So when I'm kind of using my hands to kind of explain the area, I am kind of hinting at the concept of depth. So basically we try and ensure that the foreground, the middle ground and the background, all three of these elements are a feature or play a key role in understanding or looking at depth of field when we see photography. So that is the entire idea of what depth of field is. Now, having said that, there are certain key factors on which depth of field of a photograph depends upon. The first is the f number or the f-stop number or the aperture of a photograph. So when you take a photograph, if your f number is higher. So for example, if the f number is f16 or f22, your depth of field is going to be deeper. You are going to have a larger area in focus. Obviously, consequently, if you use a shallow depth of field, which is your f5.6, your f4, even lower f2, etc., etc. So your depth of field is progressively going to become shallower, right? So you're going to have a limited area in focus. Obviously, the applications of shallow depth of field would definitely be portrait. When you shoot portraits, when you are shooting fashion photography, all of that. These are where you can definitely, have a good opportunity to create a beautiful frame by using a shallow depth of field. The second factor on which depth of field depends upon is your focal length, the focal length of the lens that we use, right? So over here, it shares an inverse relationship. What do I mean by inverse relationship? So basically, if I am using a telephoto lens, which is, you go higher, right, on the higher end of the focal length spectrum, so your 100 mm, your 150 mm, your 250 mm, etc., the higher you go, progressively shallower your depth of field becomes. And the lower your focal length, which is we go to the wide angle lenses of our spectrum, the depth of field becomes greater or deeper, right? So when we use wide angle lenses, we have a greater or a deeper depth of field. So everything is in focus. So if you're shooting, for example, a landscape, right? If you're shooting a very vast verdant green field. So in that case, if you're shooting with a wide angle lens, you are going to have a greater depth of field, a deeper depth of field. Vis-a-vis if you're shooting, a portrait, like I said, you're going to have, you're going to use, a telephoto lens to shoot a portrait. So definitely you're going to have a shallow depth of field. The third factor on which depth of field depends upon is the distance between the camera and the subject, right? So in that case, again, it's a directly proportional relationship. So if the distance between the camera and the subject is shorter, our depth of field is going to become shallower. If the distance between the camera and the subject is longer, then the depth of field becomes deeper. And another additional factor is there, but having said that, this factor is different from the others because we can't exactly control this factor actively, from frame to frame. So another factor which, regulates depth of field is the sensor size of the camera that you're using. So this factor is different from the rest of the other three because we can't actively control this factor from one frame to the next because of the sensor size, right? So the larger the sensor, the depth of field tends to be. When we keep all four of these factors in mind, we tend to take better, more visually appealing photographs.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
So now shifting gears to filmmaking, ma'am, what is the significance of the Cinema Verite film movement?
Okay, so the Cinema Verite film movement is one of the fundamental film movements when it comes to documentary filmmaking. And this movement started in France in the 1960s. And the reason for this movement starting was, as you will know, one of the factors was definitely the French New Wave, yes. But one of the key determinants, the most crucial elements, was the availability and the invention of new equipment, new shooting equipment, right? So the cameras that started becoming available to the filmmakers, they were lighter, they were more portable. So was the sound recording equipment, right? So it was possible to record sync sound on the go, which wasn't available earlier. So as a result of having the technology, as a result of this change in technology and the change in perspective which came from the French New Wave movement, the natural progression was a change in the documentary filmmaking style. So what directors started doing, and they started with a film called Chronicle of a Summer, which was a film released in 1961 by Jean Rouge and Edgar Morin. And in this film, the directors basically followed their subject. So the entire idea of this movement was you follow your subject unobtrusively, right, without affecting them, without influencing them, and you just focus on what they're doing, you focus on the situation, on what is happening, without trying to influence the situation in any way as a director. And that is how they shot. So Cinema Verite, right off the bat, one thing that we really need to keep in mind is that the terminology itself is key to understanding what this movement is all about. The translation is basically verite stands for truth, right? So truthful cinema. So the entire idea is that there has to be an element of truth. So nothing is staged. There are certain kind of elements that we keep in mind for the cinema verite movement. So shooting at real locations with non-actors, right? Nothing needs to be staged. You will unobtrusively follow what is happening. So everyday situations can be, a subject. In addition to that, social and political movements were also, issues that were interesting to directors, and they wanted to talk about it and they wanted to explore about it more. Having said that, cinema verite is a very unique kind of a perspective, because not only is it observational in style, it tends to be unobtrusive, it tries to be unobtrusive, but the directors of Chronicle of a Summer, they also decided to be present in certain situations where they were okay with, getting themselves recorded on camera, talking or speaking to the subject. And that kind of translated, or this style of movement where you follow the subject and you just observe what they are doing, it translated to other countries naturally. So where America kind of adopted this movement and called it direct cinema, where the idea is you follow the subject even more unobtrusively, almost giving a fly on the wall approach, where the subject is completely unaware of the presence of the director. So some of the key films in this movement will definitely, most important is definitely Chronicle of a Summer, but there's also Titicut Follies, right? There's also Primary, which is extremely important. And so then in that case, understanding how these films were shot, understanding how these films were made is key to kind of unfolding and delving further into this entire subject of a cinema verite.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful take on filmmaking and photography.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you everyone for watching. For more such insightful content, please don't forget to tune into the Heritage Pod. This was Joyita Devnath and this was Agnijita ma'am signing off. Thank you.